Dear friends from the United States and in general English speakers, I have decided to do this video in order to explain what is happening in Venezuela briefly. The first thing I must say is that I was very happy when Maduro was removed. The reason for that is that the communists have done such harm to my country that the thought that one of them could be punished for what he has done was very joyful. So I totally support the toppling of this tyranny. So I'm not going to criticize that point. However, I don't think that what happened on January 3rd has freed Venezuela of the communist tyranny, and I don't think that our situation is better in any way yet, at least. I don't know what the plans of Marco Rubio are. I have to see how they unfold, but up to now, our situation is actually worse than it was before January 3rd. And I have reasons to not trust Marco Rubio. So let's first explain briefly the evil of the communist tyranny. Well, Venezuela was, until 1998, a country with a very strong oil industry. We not only extracted the oil from the underground, we had very advanced research institutions in oil and anything connected to oil. We had I don't know how you say that in English, petrochemistry, very advanced. We had the last technology to extract oil from especially heavy oil from the underground. Actually, some of our technologies were stolen during the Chavista regime. For example, Orimulsion was stolen. Now some companies in the US say that they created that when we created that. Well, so we had a very strong oil company, and that oil company was diversifying its production. We had refineries in Aruba. We had a huge network of gas stations in the United States, Citgo, and we were expanding in that regard. But we also had a strong agriculture. We produced a significant amount of the agricultural products that we consumed. And we had a fairly strong non-oil industry. If you went to Dominican Republic in 1998 to the supermarket, you would find that a great percentage of the products that you could buy there were made in Venezuela. Besides that, we had a very strong network of hydroelectric production dams, and we actually not only produced enough electricity for Venezuela, but we exported our electricity to Colombia and Brazil. So we were economically a very strong country in 1998. Even after some crises that we had in the two previous decades. Okay, at that moment, Chávez came to power. And then so he won the elections in December 1998, and he won those elections fairly. I voted for Chávez, I was mistaken. He said he was not a communist though. We wanted a change because reasons that it would be long to explain. I don't want to say everything now. But then he came to power in January 1999, and he immediately went like head on to subvert the country and destroy everything. So in 3 years, he had destroyed 90% of our agriculture. He had destroyed a big percentage of our non-oil industry, and he had tried to take the universities over. I I inspired the movement to defend the universities, I have to say. And that's why I was threatened by the government in 2001. The government was unable to take the university system at that time. They only took 3 public universities, and then they couldn't take any other due to the movement in whose creation I had a very important role. But because the government couldn't take the universities, then what they did was destroying them. They destroyed the universities slowly through cutting the budget of the universities. So many of them are in ruins today, 2 decades and a half later. In 2003, moreover, Chávez decided to destroy the oil company, the public oil company. It's like killing the hen that lays golden eggs made of gold. That's what he did. Or I think in English you say the goose that lays gold eggs. Well, that's what he did. He fired 23,000 employees of the oil company in one stroke of his genius. Oh my God. Well, so he destroyed the country economically, totally. It was not very apparent during his regime because the price of the barrel of oil was more than $140. The last president of Venezuela before Chávez had the barrel of oil at $8 per barrel, $7. So Chávez had that great advantage, and then he had a lot of international loans helping him. The last president reduced our debt from $30 billion to 27, with the oil prices at $7 per barrel. Chávez, when he died, left the debt in $150 billion, with the oil barrel at $140 per barrel. Well, then Maduro came to power when Chávez died. I think Chávez was poisoned by the Cubans, but that's another chapter. Maduro came to power, and he was a Cuban puppet, really. And under him, well, the country had been invaded by Cuban agents since 2003. Chávez brought them in. In 2006 or something like that, Avilés, the leader of the CDR's, Comités de Defensa de la Revolución from Cuba, declared publicly in our newspapers that there were 20,000 civilian agents in Venezuela working. And there were, besides that, many military agents of the G2, the Cuban G2, the Cuban intelligence. Then under Maduro, the economic crisis exploded, and then we had a very big problem of supplies. I don't know if you remember that. In 2014, the supermarkets were empty, and people were like dying, starving. And the same thing happened, or graver, in 2017. Many people died of starvation or lack of basic medicines. I remember a very beloved singer who sang when he was a child for John Paul II in Guyana. He died because of the lack of very basic medicine that we could buy in Chile for 2,000 pesos at the pharmacy. That means $3 at the pharmacy. But there was none of that medicine in Chile, in Venezuela at the time, 2017. So there was a huge crisis of starvation, like a famine. I tried to send food to Venezuela. I had a guy from the US ready to send a lot of dry food to Venezuela, and it was impossible because nobody dared to receive that food in Venezuela, not even the Sisters of Mother Teresa from Calcutta. I contacted them. That was like my last resource. They say, of course, we will do that. And a month later, they say, we are sorry, Professor, but if we do that, we might die, and we prefer to keep helping the poor permanently rather than receiving this help now and then being killed. So there was no way to introduce food in Venezuela because the government prevented it. The government wanted the people to starve or migrate, which is what happened. So 10 million Venezuelans have left the country, more or less a third of the population. Another thing I must say is that the popularity of the Chavista regime is very low. Chávez won the first election in 1998, not by a slide, as the New York Times said recently. He won like 54 to 46, something like that, to Salas Römer, but lying about his communistic soul, or nature, or whatever you want to say. He won that election, but after that election, he never won an election again. It was all fraud. It was all fraud. And there was a lot also of infiltration of the opposition, which is done with many techniques that the communists use. One of them, of course, is killing all those who they cannot control, or forcing them to leave the country, which they have done systematically. Well, some of my friends were killed. They were philosophers. Some of them were killed. I'm not going to talk about that now. Okay, so that's the real situation. And Maduro was the leader of this tyranny since 2012 December until now, until January 3rd. And so he committed lots of crimes. He's a genocidal maniac. So yes, I'm very happy this is out. I am very sad that he will not be punished for his genocidal actions. If he is punished, he will be punished for very small crimes compared to what he has done. Okay, that's one page. Now, January 3rd. First of all, I have to say about that operation that it didn't happen as the images that we saw in the internet try to convey to us. I have seen a publication in the official Spanish broadcasting company, Radio Televisora Nacional Española, in which they demonstrate that those videos that we saw of the airplanes over Caracas and the throwing like missiles against targets, those videos were not real. They were taken at a different location. I will not say the location. The publication says it was Israel. I will say it was Israel. So if you see those videos carefully, you will see that those buildings are not in Caracas. Then I saw images of the explosions in the military airport in Caracas, La Carlota, and those explosions were ridiculous. They were what I saw was like black stains on the grass, really. No building destroyed at the military airport, or not even well, I don't remember then. Not even the road that the airplanes used to take off or land. Not even that. So that's one thing that we must know. Those images were false. That's not what happened that night. Moreover, they say that in the beginning, they said that the main bodyguard of Maduro, a Venezuelan guy, had been killed. Well, that's a lie. He's alive. And then they say that 32 Cubans were killed. I don't know if that's true, because one thing that happens in a communist tyranny is that you never know what really is happening. You can never know what really is happening. That I could tell many stories about this, so I don't want to do it now. I will just say that you never know what is really happening. Then we know that there was an agreement between the government and the Bush and the Trump administration, and that agreement was signed in Qatar in April. The Miami Herald published a little story about this in October, saying that the Maduro regime had found a way to stay in power with an agreement with the Trump administration, and a Chilean journalist did a very serious investigation later in January, and he shows everything that happened around this agreement. He's the one who said that it had been signed in Qatar and etc. So my first impression when I learned about this is that Maduro had been betrayed. But when I saw Maduro saying good morning to the agents in the U.S. airport, at the U.S. airport, the morning after he was captured, I thought about the difference between Maduro and Noriega. Maduro is much more criminal than Noriega. No comparison. Noriega was not a genocidal maniac. Maduro is. And he was so fresh that morning. That led me to think that Maduro knew about the agreement. Maduro knew about the agreement. Then we know that Diosdado Cabello was left in place. Maduro's position was taken by Delcy Rodriguez. Delcy Rodriguez is one of the evilest persons that you had in the Maduro regime. She is evil. She is the daughter of a terrorist who kidnapped Niehaus, a U.S. businessman in the 70s. And then he cashed the ransom, which was paid, I think, by the government of the U.S. Niehaus was an executive of Owens, Illinois, I think. Then her father, Delcy Rodriguez's father, was killed by the military in Venezuela after this crime was committed. And well, so she was adopted because her mother married another guy, none less than Carlos the Jackal. So she's the daughter of a terrorist and the stepdaughter of one of the most famous terrorists of the 20th century. Now her brother, Jorge Rodriguez, is in charge of the Congress in Venezuela. So you have Jorge Rodriguez in charge of the Congress, Delcy Rodriguez as the president, Diosdado Cabello in charge of the armed forces. That's a total disaster. Why didn't Venezuelans celebrate in the streets the arrest of Maduro? Because the tanks took to the streets immediately under the command of Diosdado Cabello, and the armed paramilitary took to the streets as well. So if anybody tried to celebrate, that person would be killed. That's why nobody celebrated. So that was a bad sign. So the reaction of the regime is a more repressive state. If anybody during the weeks following January 3rd is stopped in the streets by a police agent, that person has to give his or her cell phone to the police agent, and the police agent will revise it, will check the social networks of the person, and if there is a message in favor of Trump or the US or derogatory for Maduro, the person is arrested. That's what's happening now. So our situation is worse than it was before January 3rd. And it will stay so unless something happens. Okay, that's January 3rd. Now, the actors in this drama on the side of the United States are Marco Rubio and President Trump, plus Stephen Miller. Okay, let's start with Marco Rubio. He was a senator in 2019, and he was the senator who paid most attention to Latin America. He is of Cuban descent, so everybody expected him to be against communism. However, in 2019, January, as you might remember, Guaidó, the Venezuelan president of the Congress, let's say, it's a National Assembly, proclaimed himself president of Venezuela because he had been elected by the Assembly, alleging a void of power because they had been fraud in the previous election. That's what always happens. So he says, since there is a void of power, the assembly has the power to appoint or to elect the real president. They elected Guaidó, so Juan Guaidó appears as the new president, January 2019. I never trusted Guaidó because he was connected to Luis Ugalde, a Jesuit, who all his life was a revolutionary. He was supposed to be opposing Chávez. Chávez called him his friend in 2002, and he was his friend. People were deceived in Venezuela by this guy who used his clerical state to deceive the people. Okay, Guaidó was connected to Luis Ugalde, so I never trusted him. Plus, I knew that it is very strange that he proclaimed himself president with no power to enforce anything. But at that juncture, Mike Pence and Marco Rubio issued a series of statements, video statements, saying that they support Guaidó and that the United States would intervene to support Guaidó's claim to the presidency. That produced a lot of joy in the Venezuelan people. And there were many demonstrations for many months on the streets of Venezuela. And I want you to understand one important point. Chávez came to power and the military supported him because they thought he was a nationalist. They thought he was a patriot. When he brought the Cubans in 2003 and 2004 to control the military and control the people, the Venezuelan military didn't agree with that. So that he has had, the regime, the tyranny has had a hard time with the Venezuelan military and police. And the only way they have been able to control the situation has been through the importation of Cuban agents, with which Venezuela lost control of its destiny because it has been invaded by Cuban agents. Actually, Chávez did this because in 2002, he commanded his generals of the army to attack a civilian march, and they refused to do it. They refused to do it. And that's why he was ousted for 2 days, which is a subject to which I will come back in a moment. So, I want you to understand that he doesn't have, the regime didn't have the support of the military and the police. There were lots of military and police people who were against the regime, but they were forced to support the regime because they were watched by the Cubans. Okay, 2019 then came, and this situation with Guaidó and the video messages by Pence and Rubio, and that caused many military to think, well, this is our chance to support the people against this tyranny that is really killing the people on purpose. The Comunistas have killed at least 1 million people in Venezuela, at least. I think many more. Not many millions more, but many more than 1 million. Through starvation, lack of medicine, false heart attacks, false cancer to poisoning, and then through false common crime homicides, murders. Of those there are like thousands and thousands, but I cannot explain that at this moment, so I just mention it. Okay, so Guaidó goes out of Venezuela and then he moves to the border between Colombia and Venezuela, and there is a huge tension in January, end of January, I think it was, of 2019. And then many military are sent by the government to the border, and 2,500 of those cross the border to support Guaidó. And then in Brazil, other hundreds of them cross the border to support Guaidó. A total of 3,000 more or less, military, cross the border to support Guaidó. And then in Venezuela, many military and police people were commanded to shoot at the crowd who were demonstrating on the streets. And many of them say, I cannot shoot at the people Those guys were killed. We don't know how many, but very many. So it was a huge purge of military and police. The bravest men were purged in 2019. And that I make responsible of that Marco Rubio and Mike Pence under Donald Trump's presidency. And Juan Guaido. I think Juan Guaido is a traitor, a false oppositionist. The communists are experts in creating that, as I said earlier. I don't know if Marco Rubio did that on purpose, or he was just irresponsible or incompetent. I'm not sure. But it was horrible. It was horrible. And the result of that is that the people of Venezuela is much more oppressed after 2019 than before 2019. It was much harder to demonstrate after 2019 than before 2019. Despite that, in 2024, the people of Venezuela, which is very brave, it has taken like 25 years to come to 2024, 25 or 26 years of tyranny, communist, totalitarian tyranny, and still in 2024, the people had the courage to organize this election and to control the election and make sure that Maduro lost the election and Edmundo González won the election. And the result of that was that the government again cracked down against the civilian leaders, and they were imprisoned, most of them, many of them, the bravest of them. They are in prisons in Venezuela. Well, despite all the previous purges and crackdowns, the people keeps showing its courage, their courage and their rejection of this regime. And now, after January 3rd, Marco Rubio says, oh, all the leaders of the opposition are out. That's not true. Many are in prison. Therefore, we have to trust in the chavistas. Well, I don't think that's true. Recently, in January, after January 3rd, the militaries and police people who had crossed the border with Colombia gathered again and said, we are ready to enter Venezuela to free our country. We hope this finds a peaceful solution because we don't want a civil war. So that's our current situation. Now, I don't trust the intentions of the US government for these reasons. I already told what happened in 2019, but there are precedents. In 2002, when Chávez was ousted for 2 days, in April 13th, 2002, it was decided that he had to be brought back from the Orchila, from an island in the Caribbean, and that was decided at a meeting where the military attaché of the US was present. And 2 agents of the military personnel of the embassy of the US visited the commander-in-chief of the army, Velasco Alvarado, I think was his last name. He was a fat man, to ask him to bring Chávez back. And supposedly there was a plan to give guarantees so there wouldn't be reprisals, which is ridiculous. So we have seen this in the past. The US government saving the communist regime in Venezuela. And the exchange for that was just oil concessions for Texaco Chevron. That happened 2002, 2003, 2004 with the recall referendum that Chávez lost, and then there was a huge fraud, and Carter took sides with the tyranny. Carter is not a freedom fighter. He was very bad. And we Venezuelans knew him thoroughly. He was a liar, he was dishonest, he was very bad. Well, so we saw that in 2004. And then Texaco Chevron brought their investments under Bush protection. When Bush left power, Chávez just ignored that and confiscated their assets. Those are the assets to which Trump is referring. But they were confiscated because they did business with a communist tyranny. Now Exxon is telling Trump, because Trump wanted Trump wanted to just take the oil and leave the communists. But Exxon told Trump, we are not going to Venezuela while you have a communist regime, because we know what happens. They have no war. They respect no war. So the situation now looks a lot like Animal Farm. You remember? The communists and the capitalists agreeing in exploiting the people. That's what it looks like. However, the judiciousness of Exxon shows that really the national interest of the US that Marco Rubio is invoking is to allow Venezuela to be free again, for Venezuela to become again the long-standing and faithful ally of the US that it was until 1998. It's really despicable that the governments of the US have allowed the communists to control Venezuela because they thought they could get some kind of small advantage. Venezuela used to send cheap oil to the US, millions of barrels until 1998. And not only that, Venezuela was a great, important commercial partner of the US. And it was always an ally, formally, with signed treaties, unlike other nations who don't have signed treaties of alliance. And despite that, we were abandoned. In the tradition of the US, since Hamilton, when one has to read Alexander Hamilton, he's the greatest statesman that the US has had, with Lincoln, I think. In his writings, you don't find that the national interest is the only criterion in international relations. That's a new thing. You find that he says justice and gratitude are important. He says gratitude among nations is not the same as among individuals, because nations very rarely act out of disinterested motives. So gratitude is very has little place in international relations, but it has some place. Now justice has the first place, and he says, well, people should help other people to get rid of tyrants. He said that. So it's not just national interest in the tradition of the U.S. foreign policy. And as I was saying, Venezuela has been a great ally. Plus, the real national interest would require to free Venezuela from the communist regime. There are a couple of other aspects. Stephen Miller is not the man to deal with Venezuela. That's a guy who hates the Hispanics. He hates them. He hates us. He has said explicitly that he wants to take them out of the United States. And he's a guy who has no moral compass whatsoever, unlike Alexander Hamilton. He is totally against the tradition of foreign policy of the US, because they want now to present that it's just national interest, but it is not true. There has always been some sense of justice. And the US people have a sense of justice. I know that. So the only way to violate justice in such a flagrant way is deceiving the US people. And that's a bad policy. The other point I want to bring is this. The Russians are in Venezuela up to here. So there is no way the Russians have done nothing, considering the situation, if there is no secret agreement between Trump and the Russians. So I wonder what that implies. Well, I hope the US realizes that Venezuela is capital for the well-being of their people. You cannot destroy the fabric of the Republic of the US if you don't destroy Venezuela. And I actually think that's why the enemies of this country, who are inside as well, wanted Venezuela destroyed. Because, well, we saw with the COVID crisis, we saw that the elites of this country are not really going for the well-being of this country. We saw that in the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan as well. No good elite would leave the military material that was left behind when the US withdrew from Afghanistan. So if the elite wanted the well-being of the US and the national interests of the US and not of other foreign countries, they would rescue Venezuela. It is very important for the United States. That's all I'm going to say. Thank you, my friends. If you have questions, ask me and I can do another video. Bye.